Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart did not disappear suddenly. There was no single moment when everything changed. Instead, the end of his life unfolded over a short but very real period of decline. Visible, observed, and remembered by the people around him. By late November 1791, Mozart was already unwell. At first, the illness did not appear extraordinary. Fatigue, discomfort, and weakness were not unusual for someone working as intensely as he had been. He had been composing continuously, managing multiple projects, and navigating a demanding professional life without the stability of a fixed court position. But within days, the situation changed. The symptoms became more severe. He developed a high fever. His body began to swell, noticeably and progressively. This swelling, often described in later accounts, was not a minor detail. It affected his movement. It made even basic physical activity difficult. Those around him began to understand that this was not a passing illness. Despite this, one detail appears consistently in descriptions of his final days. His mind remained clear. He was not delirious. He was not confused. He could still think, still speak, still engage with the work that had defined his life. Even as his body weakened, his mental focus did not collapse. There are accounts, repeated across different sources, that he continued to discuss music from his bed, that he worked through sections of the Requiem, explaining how they should be structured, that he remained, in a very real sense, a composer until the end. This is not a romantic detail. It is a practical one. Mozart's identity was tied to his work, and even in illness, that did not change. The Requiem itself has become closely associated with his final days, but its presence at this moment is often overstated in dramatic retellings. It was one of several works he was engaged in. It had been commissioned anonymously, delivered through an intermediary who did not reveal the identity of the client. This has often been framed as mysterious, but in context, it was not particularly unusual. Anonymous commissions were part of the culture of patronage, especially among wealthy individuals who preferred discretion. Mozart accepted the commission and began working on it as he would any other project. What changed was not the nature of the work, but the timing. As his illness progressed, the Requiem remained unfinished. That fact would later shape how the story was remembered. In the final days, Mozart's condition deteriorated quickly. The fever intensified. The swelling increased. His strength declined to the point where movement was extremely limited. Those present would have understood that the situation was serious, but the exact nature of the illness was not clear to them. Medical understanding at the time did not allow for precise diagnosis. There were no laboratory tests, no imaging, no clear classification of disease as we understand it today. Illness was observed, described, and treated based on visible symptoms and general medical theory. This matters because it explains why, from the very beginning, Mozart's death lacked a clear explanation. The people around him could see what was happening. They could not fully explain it. There's a detail that often goes unnoticed in shorter retellings. Mozart's illness did not isolate him. He was not alone. He was surrounded by people, family members, students, and colleagues who witnessed his decline. Their accounts, written later, form the basis of what we know about his final days. These accounts do not describe chaos. They describe progression, a gradual but unmistakable worsening of condition. And throughout this progression, Mozart remained aware of what was happening. On December 5, 1791, he died. The moment itself was not marked by any recorded dramatic event. There are no verified final words that redefine the story. No last-minute revelations that changed the understanding of his life. What remains is simpler. A composer, seriously ill, died after a short period of decline. At the time, this was not considered extraordinary. People died young. Illnesses progressed quickly. Medical explanations were limited. What makes Mozart's death different is not the event itself, but what followed. The lack of a precise explanation did not stand out immediately. It became significant later, because when a life is as visible as Mozart's, and the ending is not clearly defined, the story does not stop at the moment of death. It continues. That continuation is what transforms this from a historical event into something else. A question, not what happened, but why. When Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died, the question of what exactly killed him was never clearly answered. Not at the time, and not even today. That is not because nothing was observed. It is because what was observed was not enough. The descriptions of Mozart's illness come from those who were present during his final days. They are not medical reports in the modern sense. They are observations, written later, recalled from memory, shaped by the language and understanding of the time. And yet, when placed side by side, they form a consistent picture. He had a high fever. His body became swollen. The swelling was not minor. It was described as severe enough to affect movement, possibly even making it difficult for him to turn in bed. This detail has led later observers to consider conditions that involve fluid retention, where the body begins to accumulate fluid in tissues. There are also references to pain, generalized, not localized, and to weakness that increased rapidly. What is notably absent from most accounts is confusion. There is little indication that Mozart experienced prolonged delirium or mental disorientation. This has influenced how later researchers interpret the illness, because some conditions that involve high fever also produce significant cognitive impairment. Mozart, according to those around him, remained mentally engaged. That narrows the possibilities, but it does not resolve them. Modern attempts to identify the cause of Mozart's death rely entirely on these descriptions. There are no preserved medical samples, no autopsy records in the modern sense, no direct clinical evidence. What exists is reconstruction, and reconstruction depends on interpretation. One of the most commonly proposed explanations is rheumatic fever. Rheumatic fever is a complication that can follow certain infections, particularly those caused by streptococcal bacteria. It can affect multiple systems in the body, including the heart, joints, and skin. In severe cases, it can lead to inflammation and fluid accumulation. Mozart is known to have experienced illness earlier in life that some historians believe may have been related to rheumatic fever. If that is true, it is possible that his final illness was a recurrence or complication. This theory has some support. It explains the fever. It can explain systemic involvement, but it does not fully explain all aspects of the reported swelling. Another possibility is kidney-related disease. Certain forms of kidney failure can lead to fluid retention, causing visible swelling in the body. When the kidneys are not functioning properly, the body is unable to regulate fluids and waste products effectively. This could produce the kind of swelling described in Mozart's final days. It could also progress relatively quickly. But again, this is an interpretation based on limited evidence. There is no direct confirmation. Infectious disease is another category often considered. In the 18th century, infections were common and often fatal. Without antibiotics, even relatively minor infections could become severe. If Mozart developed an acute infection, whether bacterial or otherwise, it could explain the rapid progression of symptoms. Fever, systemic weakness, and eventual collapse are consistent with this type of scenario. But infections vary widely, and without more specific descriptions, it is not possible to identify which type, if any, was responsible. There are also less common theories. Some have suggested complications related to autoimmune conditions. Others have proposed rare diseases that might match the limited symptom profile. But these theories tend to rely on increasingly speculative connections. The further one moves from the original descriptions, the more uncertain the conclusions become. One important point is often overlooked. Mozart's death, while tragic, was not unusual for the time. Life expectancy in the 18th century was significantly lower than it is today. Many individuals died young, often from illnesses that would now be treatable or preventable. What makes Mozart's case stand out is not the pattern of illness. It is the absence of a clear label. In a modern context, we expect precision. We expect a defined cause. When that is missing, it feels incomplete. There is also the issue of timing. Mozart's illness progressed quickly. This has led some to question whether the speed of decline suggests something unusual. But rapid illness was not uncommon in that period. Without modern medical intervention, conditions that might now be managed over weeks or months could become fatal in a matter of days. Speed, in this context, does not necessarily indicate anything extraordinary. Another factor complicates the picture. The accounts of Mozart's illness were not recorded in a controlled or standardized way. They were written after the fact. Memory plays a role. Interpretation plays a role. And over time, these accounts have been retold, translated, and sometimes reshaped. Each retelling introduces the possibility of subtle changes. Emphasis shifts. Details are added or simplified. And what begins as observation gradually becomes narrative. This is where the medical mystery begins to overlap with something else. Not conspiracy, but storytelling. The lack of a definitive diagnosis leaves space, and that space invites explanation. Not necessarily false explanation, but constructed explanation attempts to create clarity where clarity does not fully exist. If Mozart had died in a modern hospital, his illness would likely have been documented in detail. Tests would have been conducted. The cause of death would have been recorded with a high degree of specificity. That did not happen. And because it did not happen, the question remains open. What can be said with reasonable confidence is limited. Mozart experienced a short, severe illness. It involved fever and significant swelling. It progressed rapidly. It ended in death. Everything beyond that is interpretation. Some interpretations are more plausible than others. Some are widely accepted, but none can be confirmed with certainty. This is the core of the medical mystery. Not that there are no explanations, but that there is no final one, and that absence of a single definitive answer is what allows the story to continue, not as a medical case, but as an unresolved question attached to a life that was anything but ordinary. When Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died, the question of what exactly killed him was never clearly answered, not at the time, and not even today. That is not because nothing was observed. It is because what was observed was not enough. The descriptions of Mozart's illness come from those who were present during his final days. They are not medical reports in the modern sense. They are observations, written later, recalled from memory, shaped by the language and understanding of the time. And yet, when placed side by side, they form a consistent picture. He had a high fever. His body became swollen. The swelling was not minor. It was described as severe enough to affect movement, possibly even making it difficult for him to turn in bed. This detail has led later observers to consider conditions that involve fluid retention, where the body begins to accumulate fluid in tissues. There are also references to pain, generalized, not localized, and to weakness that increased rapidly. What is notably absent from most accounts is confusion. There is little indication that Mozart experienced prolonged delirium or mental disorientation. This has influenced how later researchers interpret the illness, because some conditions that involve high fever also produce significant cognitive impairment. Mozart, according to those around him, remained mentally engaged. That narrows the possibilities, but it does not resolve them. Modern attempts to identify the cause of Mozart's death rely entirely on these descriptions. There are no preserved medical samples, no autopsy records in the modern sense, no direct clinical evidence. What exists is reconstruction, and reconstruction depends on interpretation. After Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died, he was buried in Vienna in a common grave. This was standard practice at the time. Many people who were not part of the highest nobility were buried this way. Individual marked graves were not always used. His burial followed local custom. Mozart's financial situation at the time of his death was unstable, but not unusual for a freelance musician. He did not hold a permanent court position. His income came from commissions, performances, and teaching. This meant that his earnings could vary significantly from one period to another. Despite this, he was active in Vienna's musical life. His works were performed, and he had students and patrons. In the years after his death, questions began to emerge about the cause. The illness had not been clearly identified. This uncertainty led to speculation. At some point, the idea that Mozart may have been poisoned began to circulate. There was no direct evidence supporting this claim. The theory later became associated with Antonio Salieri. Salieri was an established composer in Vienna and held official positions within the court. While both composers worked in the same environment, there is no credible historical evidence linking Salieri to Mozart's death. No formal accusation was made at the time. Later records show that Salieri remained active in Vienna's musical life and taught Mozart's son. During the 19th century, the story was repeated and expanded in literature and drama. The idea of rivalry between Mozart and Salieri became more defined and more dramatic in these retellings. These portrayals were not based on new evidence, but they influenced how the story was remembered. Another detail often associated with Mozart's death is the Requiem. He died before completing it. The work was later finished by Franz Xaver Süssmayr using Mozart's drafts. The fact that Mozart was working on a Mass for the Dead at the time of his illness has often been highlighted, but there is no evidence that it was connected to the cause of his death. Today, the most widely accepted explanation is that Mozart died of natural causes, even though the exact illness cannot be identified with certainty. The poisoning theory is not supported by historical evidence. What remains is a case where the available information is limited. Mozart died after a short illness. The details of that illness were recorded, but not precisely defined. Later interpretations added meaning to events that were ordinary at the time. The result is a story that appears more complex than the evidence suggests. The facts are clear. The conclusions are limited.